Hello, everybody. Welcome back to a brand new episode of Decoding the Unknown. As always, I'm your host, Simon. Welcome. Emma's written me the script. It's all about the Vela incident. Why did the US government cover it up? I've heard of this. I have no memory. I'm sure I've made a video about this because it's very famous, like on one of my other channels, but I have no memory of this. Welcome to the show. I've never read this before. Let's jump in. On the 22nd of September, 1979, two brilliants. Oh, I know what it is already. Is this the mysterious nuclear test that destroyed Britain's first satellite? Is that the Vela? I think it might be. Flashes lit up the sky above the southern Indian Ocean. The flashes only lasted for a fraction of a second, but were distinctive enough to draw the attention of two orbiting satellites, and experts all agreed that it was an indication that a nuclear bomb had been detonated. But no one knew who it belonged to, and no country ever came forward to claim responsibility for it. I hate to do the spoiler alert, but it was Israel and South Africa, right? They were working on nuclear bombs together, right? And then this was allegedly their test, right? Just before we continue, a word from our wonderful sponsor today, and that is Incogni. Have you ever tried Googling yourself and then you find your home address, you find your phone number, maybe you know who your relatives are, and you're like, oh, wait, why is that in the public domain? Why is that out there? I don't like that. The reality is that scammers and identity thieves can also see that information, and I'll tell you what, they love that. But that's where Incogni comes in. They don't just hit the big data brokers automatically. They've even got a custom removals feature that lets you point them to any site exposing your data. All you do, you pop in your link, and their privacy experts handle the takedown for you. It is one of the easiest ways to cut off risks like scams, even stalking or identity theft before they even start. And, you could do this by yourself, but it would be a nightmare. It would take you hundreds of hours. Incogni keeps working in the background all the time, making sure that your info stays gone. Their removal process is even verified by Deloitte, a big company. You've probably heard of those guys, so you know it's legit. Take your personal data back with Incogni. Use the code UNKNOWN at the link below and get 60% off an annual plan. That's incogni.com/unknown. Now back to today's episode. In the months and years that followed, the US government blamed the explosion on meteor strikes and freak lightning storms, despite mounting evidence that a significant amount of radiation had been released into the atmosphere. But why did the US cover it up? And what does it mean for the nuclear arms race as a whole? The War of Three Worlds. First of all, a short history lesson is in order that is the very definition of the past was the worst. Okay, here we go. One of my favourite phrases. On the 6th and the 9th of August 1945, two atomic bombs were released over the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The first one, Little Boy, would end up killing between 90,000 and 166,000 people. And the second one, Fat Man, ended up killing between 60,000 and 80,000 people. It's estimated that at least 52% of the victims either died instantly or just minutes after the bombs hit. Yeah, and just a little reminder, despite those death tolls, these nuclear bombs are tiny. They were tiny little nuclear bombs that we have far outdone by, I believe, orders of magnitude. The rest slowly withered away in the weeks that followed, and the Western journalists who were sent to the fallen cities to report on the US's great victory over Japan came back horrified and emotionally scarred. Yeah, no shit. They just got to a city that's been destroyed by a nuclear bomb. They explained that the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been turned into death factories. That's a quote. The idea was that detonating those bombs was for the greater good, and that it was the very best way to ensure a quick end to the war. But of course, the US and its allies had no idea what the fallout would be. Later on, President Harry Truman reportedly claimed that after he had heard how many people had died in the attack, he'd given orders to stop the bombing of Japan because he didn't like the idea of killing, quote, all those kids, and, quoting again, the thought of wiping out another 100,000 people was too horrible. I mean, yes, I get it. But also, I know there's a lot of historical debate over this, and whether a land invasion of Japan by the Pacific Forces would have been worse. And maybe, the Soviets were already making inroads on Japan, so maybe this wasn't entirely the reason Japan surrendered. But I mean, come on, it played a big part, no doubt. Like, one bomb basically wipes out a city. In the book, The Making of the Atomic Bomb by Richard Rhodes, a US naval officer who visited Nagasaki in September 1945, he described the fallen cities as follows. This is a long quote, which I imagine is going to be filled with misery. A smell of death and corruption pervades the place, ranging from the ordinary carrion smell to somewhat subtler stenches with strong overtones of ammonia. Sounds like he's describing a wine. Woody. The general impression, which transcends those derived from the evidence of our physical senses, is one of deadness, the absolute essence of death in the sense of finality, without hope of resurrection. And all this is not localized, it's everywhere, and nothing has escaped its touch. In most ruined cities, you could bury the dead, clean up the rubble, rebuild the houses, and have a living city again. One feels that is not so here. Like the ancient Sodom and Gomorrah, its site has been sown with salt, and Ichabod, or where the glory is written over its gates. It's rather poetic. Might describe as a little purple. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended up becoming a truly horrific FAFO moment. Oh, is that what we're calling fuck arounds and find out now? FAFO? FAFO? I like that. In world history. And on top of discovering the effect that a nuclear bombing has on the population, the US realized that they just handed their enemy the perfect weapon to defeat them. All the Soviets needed, was a nuclear bomb and a way to transport it, and they could have the US on their knees, faster than you could say, Nostrovia! The Soviets already knew this, of course, and by the end of World War II, they were already hard at work developing their own nuclear weapons. They conducted their first successful nuclear test in August 1949, and this kicked off what we now refer to as the nuclear arms race. The US, the Soviets, and their allies spent the next 50 years building and developing vast stockpiles of nuclear weapons to use just in case. And the US also came up with a whole list of policies outlining what a country could and couldn't do while building their nuclear arsenal in an attempt to level the playing field and limit the harmful effects of nuclear weapons testing on the world's population. It's a weird one, isn't it? Everyone's developing all these horrible bombs that could absolutely destroy the entire planet. Meanwhile, they're like, yeah, and we also should make sure we have rules so we don't actually use these motherfuckers again, right? And most of these were in response to verifiable effects that their own nuclear tests were having on not only their budgets, but also their citizens and the environment. For example, the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, or Limited Test Ban Treaty, was signed on the 5th of August 1963 and, quote, prohibited all test detonations of nuclear weapons, except for those conducted underground. Right, and that's all fantastic and everything, but it's only going to apply to the countries that sign up to it. By the time the treaty was drawn up, 269 atmospheric and underwater nuclear tests had already been conducted by the US, the UK, and the Soviets, and it had taken them almost 20 years to realize that you didn't have to drop a bomb on a city to kill hundreds of thousands of people. It's theorized that these tests led to a 20.6% increase in infant mortality rates in the US. Oh my god, I never knew that. That's wild. And a 14.2% increase in infant mortality rates in Europe. That's more than 1 million babies who died as a result of nuclear fallout. Well, fuck me, I had no idea. Oh my god, that's super interesting. How have I never heard this before? It's also estimated that between... Breaking news, testing nuclear bombs is bad. To the shock of nobody. But this is quite a figure, isn't it? It's also estimated that between 1951 and 1973, up to 690,000 US citizens who lived east of the Nevada test site died because the cow's milk they consumed contained traces of iodine-130. I'm sorry, 690,000. I feel like I've been transported into a parallel universe where there are all these enormous death tolls from nuclear bomb testing that I never knew about. Jesus Christ, 690,000 US citizens. That's like not a tiny amount of the entire population. There's a ridiculously large number of people. There's 200 and something times the number of people who died on 9/11. Good lord. The Partial Test Ban Treaty was signed in over 100 states, which included the US, the UK, India, Pakistan, Israel, South Africa, and the Soviet Union. France and China did not sign the ban and would continue to conduct atmospheric tests until 1980. France. Typical. The Partial Test Ban Treaty was followed by the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the Outer Space Treaty, the Treaty of Tlatelolco, and the Seabed Arms Control Treaty, as well as the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. In response to the partial ban, the US implemented Project Vela, which was supposed to basically spy on the Soviet Union's nuclear program and help the United States Department of Defense keep a simultaneous eye on all the other players in the nuclear arms race. That makes a lot of sense, because I think back in the day, people were like, oh no, definitely not going to test any. Testing more nuclear bombs, please. In the atmosphere, no, we do it underground. But, if no one's looking. Project Vela consisted out of two monitoring systems: Vela Uniform, which monitored underground and underwater nuclear tests by analyzing seismic signals, and Vela Hotel, which used satellites to monitor atmospheric tests. It was later replaced by Vela Sierra, which could also monitor nuclear tests that were conducted in outer space. The first pair of Vela satellites. Have nuclear bombs been blown up in outer space? I feel like they have, right? Because we know that they're not super effective as space-based weapons. I'm sure they're still pretty effective, though they are nuclear bombs after all. Isn't that what they used in Battlestar Galactica? They were using nukes, right? That was a good-ass TV show. The new one. The one from 20 years ago, not the one from, history. The first pair of Vela satellites were launched a week after the Partial Test Ban Treaty was signed, and they remained operational until 1968. They were then replaced by 2 advanced Vela satellites, which were equipped with 12 X-ray detectors and 18 neutron and gamma ray detectors. They were also equipped with 2 non-imaging photoid sensors called bang meters. Right. Which are used to detect nuclear explosions in the atmosphere within a range of 3,000 miles. Within months of the first pair of satellites being launched, the US realized that the Vela program might end up having far more uses than just spying on the Soviets. The system of seismographs that they'd installed was still being used to warn countries of impending earthquakes and tsunamis, and the satellite could monitor incoming storm systems and solar storms, and unintentionally help scientists to discover and monitor gamma rays. Wait, is in the radioactive gamma rays? That's how we discovered those? They're really scary. Gamma rays are intense. You guys heard of a gamma ray burst? It's the idea that I think it's a neutron star, some neutron star way out in space. I don't know, collapses or some shit like that. I don't know, don't ask me the science. And it does something called a gamma ray burst, which is just an absolutely insane amount of gamma radiation, and it blasts out in a very specific direction. So most of the time you're fine. It's the odds of it hitting our little slice of the universe are infinitesimally small. But if we do hit those odds, life on the planet would be over before we even know. Because a gamma ray burst travels at the speed of light, and it just immediately just kills everything. So we'd just be hit, and then we would not be here. So it just winked out of existence the entirety of our civilization, which is really intense. Maybe Elon Musk's onto something. Get us to Mars. Come on, Elon. Although, I don't know. Mars and the Earth are really close by in terms of galactic scale. So maybe Mars would also be fucked. But it doesn't matter anyway. We'd just be gone. We wouldn't care. But the most controversial discovery ever was the unexplained double flash that took place on the 22nd of September 1979. The Vela incident. At around midnight on the 22nd of September 1979, technicians working for the Air Force Technical Applications Center, or AFTAC, because of course you've got to have an acronym, it's America, at the Patrick Air Force Base in Florida, were going through the readouts that they'd received from the Vela 6911 satellite when they noticed a double hump signal. Hump signals occurred when the bang meters on the Vela satellites picked up some on particularly bright flashes like solar flares or lightning storms, but the double hump was an indication of the telltale double flash that occurred when a nuclear bomb was detonated. The technicians knew that when the 2 flashes occurred, the Vela 6911 satellite had been positioned over the southern hemisphere and had been monitoring an area of 3,000 square miles that encompassed the southern tip of Africa, the South Atlantic, the South Indian Ocean, and part of Antarctica. They also knew that there was a storm in the area and that the flashes hadn't been caused by lightning. I imagine lightning's really big, right? Lightning's pretty powerful, lots of volts or whatever in there. But a nuclear bomb? Gonna guess that's a little more. There's a little more juice to that, isn't there? The AFTAC technicians had already identified and confirmed the detonation of 41 nuclear explosions using the Vela satellite, so they knew what to look for. But they hadn't expected to see a nuclear explosion take place in the southern hemisphere, not when all of the known nuclear powers were more than 10,000 kilometers away. Hello, South Africa! Still, they notified the Department of Defense, who immediately sprang into action to try and determine if a nuclear explosion had indeed taken place. Using data recordings that were compiled by various scientific stations whose purpose was to monitor the Soviets, the US was able to determine if an explosion had taken place, it would have taken place between the French-owned Crozet Islands and the Prince Edward Islands, which belonged to South Africa. Keep that country in mind. Later that same day, the US Air Force sent several surveillance aircraft to monitor the area and perform atmospheric tests to see whether or not they could detect any evidence that a nuclear explosion had occurred. They reported that a storm was raging in the area and was slowly making its way east toward Australia, but this enabled them to gather samples of rainwater from the area that they could use to conduct tests. They didn't find any nuclear debris in the rainwater, but according to a partially declassified report from the Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory, dated the 26th of November 1979, quote, the institute director described the rise in radioactive fallout as the kind one would expect from a small but recent atomic explosion in the atmosphere. There we go. There's a very heavily redacted image here. It says nuclear debris. Redacted, like 4 lines. 2.5 lines. The institute director described the rise in radioactive fallout as the kind that one would expect from a small Oh wait, sorry, that's just what we read. It's just repeating it. But there was a lot of redacted stuff here. Based on the various sources of data that the US government had access to, they were able to determine that the nuclear bomb had a positive yield of just 3 kilotons. Little Boy, the bomb that had been used on Hiroshima, had a yield of 15 kilotons, so in comparison, the nuclear bomb that had been detonated in the southern hemisphere was tiny. Yes, and compared to modern-day weapons, as I said, Little Boy was tiny. So this is tiny. This is like a nuclear explosion you basically brush off. What's more, nuclear bombs were usually tested in the early hours of the day so that nuclear scientists could record the mushroom cloud and use its size to determine the yield of the bomb. But since this one occurred at around 3 a.m. local time and was detonated in the middle of a storm, it suggests that whoever had detonated the bomb didn't want anyone to know that they'd done it. Guys, you've heard of the satellites though, right? They're the satellites. People knew about the satellites. They were detecting earthquakes and shit. It would be weird if people didn't know about the satellites because the satellites are there for deterrence. So now the US had to determine who had been responsible for the test. Well, according to a memorandum that had been drawn up by the CIA titled The 22nd of December 1979 event, the US reasoned that the only other capable nuclear powers who might want to conduct atmospheric tests were France and China, since they'd refused to sign the Partial Test Ban Treaty, but they had no reason to conduct tests in the Southern Hemisphere. You know, one thing is damn not according to America. Definitely not Israel. Definitely not. At the time, 5 of the countries had been classified as nuclear states: Pakistan, Taiwan, India, Israel, and South Africa. The intelligence community, aka the CIA, were fully aware that Pakistan and Taiwan didn't have enough fissile material to make a nuclear bomb, and the only countries that might have the capability to perform a nuclear test were Israel, India, and South Africa. Wait, so why are they classified as nuclear powers if they haven't successfully detonated a nuclear bomb? I kind of felt that was like the cost of entering the club, no? However, all 3 of them had signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty. So that means they definitely didn't do it. Right, guys? Everyone always 100% sticks by treaties. So if they'd wanted to conduct an atmospheric test, they would have needed to ensure that the rest of the world didn't find out about it, and conducting one at sea was a clever way to go about it, except for the satellites. They know about the satellites. According to the report, quote, the testing of a nuclear device at sea would not have needed to involve more than 2 or 3 ships or aircraft, including several dozen crewmen and technicians. Equipped with appropriate diagnostic instruments, they could have set the test within a few hours, detonated the device, obtained required data within minutes after the explosion, and dispersed within another few hours. End quote. Alright, so the CIA set out to determine who was responsible, and they were able to point fingers to both Israel and South Africa. According to the CIA's memorandum, the South African Navy... Oh, I'm sorry. So this isn't... I'm just remembering now. I said at the beginning about this being a nuclear test that destroyed Britain's first satellite. I think that was another something incident, because I'm pretty sure it was a nuclear test from the United States that destroyed it. An atmospheric test. What was that called? It was something incident. Doesn't matter. A video for another day. According to the CIA's memorandum, the South African Navy had issued an announcement in August 1979 that explained that between the 17th and the 23rd of September, the South African Navy were going to be conducting various training exercises, and as a result, the naval base in Simonstown was going to be off-limits to the public. According to the CIA's memorandum, although such a closure might not be required for a nuclear test at sea, it could have screened secretive loading or unloading operations, as well as ship movements. In addition to the closure of the naval base in Simonstown, the naval base at Saldanha Bay and their search and rescue unit was placed on high alert, and the chief of South Africa's Defence Force reported that he would be touring South America around the end of 1979, none of which is suspicious at all. Not at all. What's more, the South African government had all but bragged about the success of the supposed test afterward. According to the memorandum, then Prime Minister P.W. Botha conducted a party meeting on the 25th of September 1979 and told party members that, quote, South Africa's enemies might find out we have military weapons they do not know about. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Subtle. I feel like we know the answer to this mystery. It was the South Africans. He also made a speech during an anniversary dinner, during which he paid tribute to the South African nuclear scientists who had been engaged in secret work of a strategic nature. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. He reportedly said that for security reasons their names could not be mentioned and that they would never gain recognition in South Africa or abroad that they deserved. Bro, could you be winking any fucking harder, mate? Nothing to see here. South Africa and its nuclear ambitions had been on the US's radar since the 1950s. Because of its rich gold mines, South Africa had easy access to vast quantities of uranium, and in 1952 they built a full-scale uranium extraction plant with the help of both the US and the UK. Right, what could go wrong there, US and UK? Brilliant work. Helping South Africa extract uranium from the ground to build an atomic bomb. Pre-apartheid South Africa, by the way. Good job, guys. Well done. By 1955, there's 16 operational uranium extraction plants and sold their uranium to the Combined Development Agency, which was co-owned by the US and the UK. All right, there we go. Oh, look, a country has something that a richer country wants. Let's just ignore the moral problems with our country and all the other problems and just go get that uranium. What could possibly go wrong? After attending the very first United Nations conference on the peaceful uses of atomic energy in 1955, South Africa developed its own nuclear research and development program and built the Pelindaba Nuclear Research Center with the goal of being able to build their first nuclear power plant, again with the aid of the US and the UK. They trained South Africa's nuclear engineers, provided test reactors, weapons-grade uranium, and taught them how to produce heavy water. But in 1958, Dr. Ampie Roux, then head of South Africa's Atomic Energy Board, complained that they were too heavily reliant on the US and the UK, and they were making it almost impossible for the South African scientists to become experts in their field because, quote, some of the most important developments in the field of nuclear power, particularly in more highly developed countries such as the US and Britain, have so many military implications that no reference would be found to them in the unclassified literature. Yeah, and I mean, honestly, probably for the fucking best that you classify that shit. You don't want it floating around out there in books, I guess it was the past, in books, floppy disks. It took the South African Atomic Energy Board 20 years worth of research and development before they started building the Coburg nuclear power plant in Cape Town, and even then, they had to rely on a design by a French company called Framatome to be able to build a safe and reliable reactor that wouldn't explode and kill everyone who lived in the mother city. Yes, probably, that's a good thing to share that information rather than the bomb information. Also, why do people build nuclear power plants in cities or close to... South Africa's a big-ass country. There's lots of desert in the north, or I don't know, whatever you call it, like wilderness. It's kind of brown on a map, right? Northern South Africa. Can't they just build it up there in the middle of nowhere? And I know people are like, logistically, it's really complicated. Yeah, but less complicated than a nuclear plant blowing up in a city. A la Japan, a la Ukraine. But as we know, every country that has claimed that they're only going to use nuclear power to generate electricity was fucking lying. And South Africa, surely there's one. Surely there's some country who's like, no, we have no interest in... What about Switzerland or something? Don't they have nuclear power and they're not making bombs? It's Switzerland. Yo, Siri, does Switzerland have atomic energy? It asked me whether I want to use ChatGPT. Obviously, because ChatGPT's not, our word, like Siri. 32.4% of Swiss energy is made by nuclear power, according to ChatGPT, so that could be a lie. But look, there we go. And South Africa started developing their own peaceful nuclear explosives back in 1968. Peaceful. Although I do say, nuclear bombs have led to a very long period of peace, because no one actually wants to get blown the up by a nuclear bomb, live in a nuclear wasteland, and endure many nuclear winters. Or just one nuclear winter? It's nuclear winter because it's just never not winter, right? What the fuck? Why can't a nuclear thing be like, it's just endless summer, rather than endless winter? That sounds way... Can't we just do it just right so we get just endless spring or endless autumn? You know, the nicest seasons?
This snow is beautiful. I'm glad global warming never happened.
Actually, it did. But thank God nuclear winter canceled it out.
According to the book Revisiting South Africa's Nuclear Weapons Program by David Albright and Andrea Stricker, quote, peaceful nuclear explosives, or PNEs, were being purchased by the United States and the Soviet Union for a variety of civil purposes, such as creating harbors, mines, mountain passes, and gas exploitation. Oh, okay, so these are actually, like, non-war uses. I thought it meant just, like, maintaining the peace. The quote continues, thus, one motivation for South Africa's own PNE program would have been to match, albeit on a smaller scale, work being done by the major nuclear powers. The book later goes on to explain that the South African government would later deny any and all claims that they'd been interested in developing nuclear weapons, and between 1969 and 1988, the South African government was involved in 3 wars simultaneously, and they figured that nuclear weapons would act as a powerful deterrent against these wars escalating any further. On the 26th of August 1966, South Africa became involved in a border war against the South West African People's Organization, or SWAPO, and the People's Liberation Army of Namibia, in what's now known as the South African Border War. In 1972, they also became involved in the Angolan War of Independence on behalf of Portugal, who were still fighting the MPLA, UNITA, and the FNLA, who were backed by both Cuba and the Soviets. What a fun time to be alive. At the same time, the South Africans were also fighting a war on their home turf against military wings of the ANC, who had been trained by the Chinese and the Soviets, and who regularly supplied them with weapons and bombs to use against the apartheid government. So, in 1973, scientists working at the Pelindaba Nuclear Research Facility started developing gun-type, implosion-type, and thermonuclear weapons to, quote, use when facing insurmountable odds requiring an act of supreme heroism. What? Supreme heroism. Let's kill all the civilians. Look at Hiroshima. Supreme heroism. It's like, no, it's not heroic. There's nothing heroic about it. It's just pragmatism. And start developing their own methods for enriching uranium. The US became aware of their efforts to enrich uranium when South African scientists so casually started asking US nuclear scientists for advice. They'll just give stories. It's like, yo, Bob, hope you've been well since university. So, got any tips, mate? And that led to the CIA keeping closer tabs on South Africa's nuclear program. What? However, according to an article posted on the US National Security Archive titled US Intelligence and the South African Bomb, quote, years after South Africa claimed that it had developed a new technique for uranium enrichment, the US was uncertain as to what it entailed. In addition, the documents show that in the 1980s, the US did not know the status of South African bomb development. They also reveal a dispute between the Director of Central Intelligence's Non-Proliferation Center and the state's INR over the likelihood that South Africa's declaration to the International Atomic Energy Agency concerning the quantity of fissile material produced constituted an honest declaration or an act of deception. In other words, oh thank God there's another words, because that is the most bureaucratic language that I've ever heard in my life. In other words, they suspected that South Africa might be developing nuclear weapons, but they didn't have any proof of it. Why can't you just say that, government? Why do you have to make everything sound complicated? I was on a British, on the UK Gov website or whatever the other day, and apparently there's this, and I'm like, it's all very easy to read. Apparently there was some huge initiative where they have to make all of the government websites easy to understand by regular people. So you can go on and you can read about, I don't know, fucking legislation, like health and safety or whatever, nuclear bombs or like whatever policy, and it has to be easily understandable. It's called like plain English or something. And like, that's a really fucking good idea. Because those websites before were just like, what the fuck is happening? I have no idea what you mean. I have no idea what I have to do. And now it's just like, do you have this? Try this. You're like, oh, brilliant, thank you. Although nowadays you'd just be like, oh, this website's really complicated. Let's just ask ChatGPT what it actually means. Like the number of times I've typed into ChatGPT, can you explain this to me like I'm 5? Can you explain this to me like I'm a particularly intelligent golden retriever? That is until 1977 when the Soviets told the US that the South Africans were busy building a nuclear test site in the Kalahari Desert. Kalahari Desert, perfect, just build all the nuclear power plants there as well. You've already nuked the shit out of it, I guess, or I guess not. I guess not, right, because they did the one air test, but just build the nuclear power plants there. And then build some big wires taking that power places. The KGB had a spy named Commodore Dieter Gerhardt who worked at the Simonstown Naval Base, and he explained that the base had supplied the Atomic Energy Board with a naval barrel that they were going to use in tests. The Soviets wanted the US's assistance in stopping South Africa from developing nuclear weapons, and the US agreed. Isn't that nice? You know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The US then basically called South Africa to the principal's office, and together with their allies gave them a right talking to, since they were signatories of the Partial Test Ban Treaty. They also threatened to conduct an inspection of the Kalahari testing site, and the South African government had to scramble to hide any evidence that they'd been developing PNEs, peaceful nuclear explosives, before the American inspectors arrived. But the heightened levels... yeah, maybe Saddam should have tried that. Just like, okay, guys, there was nothing there. Why not just let them in? Why just take a look? We really shit at this. Although, to be fair, weapons of mass destruction they had before, just not nuclear ones, like biological and stuff. So, chemical? Biological? What was the ones that Saddam used to just wipe out that whole fucking village? Fucking monster. It was biological, wasn't it? God, what a piece of shit. Iraq War, very badly done. Very badly pulled off. Very, very messy. But at least Saddam Hussein fucking is dead. He was a real fucking monster. But the heightened levels of scrutiny that they were under allegedly didn't stop then Prime Minister P.W. Botha from doing everything in his power to ensure that South Africa had easy access to its own nuclear weapons, since he was concerned that the commies and their black allies were going to take over Southern Africa, and that the US had no interest in stepping up on behalf of South Africa's white elites. According... I feel like there's a modern-day parallel with somehow Elon Musk being in here somehow, allegedly, in my opinion. According to the book The Unspoken Alliance by Sasha Polakar-Saransky, quote, Botha and his generals believed that South Africa was a primary target in Moscow's crosshairs and faced a total onslaught, both from within and from neighboring Marxist and Soviet-backed black countries. Magnus Milan, now the head of the South African Defence Force, called on all white South Africans to mobilise for total war because survival concerns every citizen in South Africa directly and personally. So, Botha reasoned that when South Africa inevitably found itself staring down the barrel of a Soviet gun, he needed the US and its allies to step in on their behalf and end the war before South Africa as a whole was blown to bits. According to the book Revisiting South Africa's Nuclear Weapons, unlike any other nuclear strategy, South Africa's strategy envisioned no actual operational use of nuclear weapons. It was designed to be a bluff. However, the challenge was to ensure that if nuclear strategy was exercised, South Africa was perceived as having the means to resolve to use nuclear weapons militarily. The goal was to deter aggression, not to be involved in nuclear war that South Africa could not survive. Yeah, which I think is the primary reason to have nuclear weapons. It's a deterrent thing. The plan included 3 strategies. Number 1, South Africa had to get their hands on at least 5 or 6 nuclear weapons to keep on the shelf. Number 2, should South Africa find itself with its back against a wall, the existence of the country's nuclear weapons would be conveyed to Western countries, primarily the USA, in a covert manner. And if this didn't work, 3, an underground test would be performed to demonstrate South Africa's nuclear capability, and 4, an above-ground test would be performed as a final warning to South Africa's enemies. Not a bad strategy, to be honest. According to the book Revisiting South Africa's Nuclear Weapons, quote, an important aspect of the nuclear strategy was to maintain uncertainty about the program. Protecting uncertainty, it required the government to ensure that the nuclear weapons activities remained secret. Yeah, I mean, South Africa gave up its nuclear weapons. Israel, which has never confirmed that it has them, didn't, and they maintain this uncertainty today, which again, kind of a good strategy. I thought it'd be so funny. The nuclear deterrent in the UK is called Trident, and I swear every few years there's a big debate about how much Trident costs. It's it's billions of dollars. Do we really need them? And it's I don't know, just pretend you did it. Just be like, no, we renewed and upgraded Trident. And then, I don't know, spend the money on healthcare or something and just pretend. The problem was, South Africa didn't have the required industrial base to manufacture its own nuclear weapons, and they couldn't import what they needed because of the sanctions that had been implemented against the apartheid government. As a side note, when I was in school, that's me, the author, Emma, we were told that the UN and later the US had implemented sanctions against the apartheid government because apartheid was bad. Turns out that's not what happened, according to the book Revisiting South Africa's Nuclear Weapons Program. In November 1977, the UN Security Council approved unanimously a resolution to make mandatory a military arms embargo on South Africa. that had been voluntary since 1963. While citing apartheid as the reason for this action, this resolution also expressed grave concern that South Africa is at the threshold of producing nuclear weapons and declared that all states shall refrain from any cooperation with South Africa in the manufacture and development of nuclear weapons. Considering that apartheid had been a thing since 1945 and the whole world had only just found out about the Kalahari nuclear test site, it seems as if South Africa's nuclear program was actually the real motivator, which kind of pisses me off, to be honest. Yeah, I get that. But it's also like, oh, nice side benefit. Also, works against apartheid too. Anyway, this is where Israel comes in. In case you don't know, Israel officially doesn't have any nuclear weapons. Now, everyone knows that they do, but they've been denying it since the 1960s. Israeli scientists had been working closely alongside the French when they developed their own nuclear bombs in the 1950s, and according to the counter-proliferation papers compiled by the US Army, quote, Israel and France were at a similar level of expertise after the war, and Israeli scientists could make significant contributions to the French effort. Progress in nuclear science and technology in France and Israel remained closely linked throughout the early 50s. Following the Suez Crisis in 1956, Israel approached France and asked for their assistance in creating nuclear weapons to use against the Soviets. And according to the counter-proliferation papers, France helped the Israelis by building an underground nuclear reactor at Dimona, which Israel claimed was a textile plant. In fact, the two countries worked so closely together that experts claimed that, quote, the French nuclear test in 1960 made 2 nuclear powers, not 1. Such was the depth of collaboration. Yes, I think this is all pretty famous now, right? And just widely accepted as history. You know, they did it together, and Israel still has them, and South Africa doesn't. In the years that followed, Israel's nuclear weapons arsenal came along pretty nicely. And by the end of the Yom Kippur War in 1973, the US believed that Israel had between 10 and 20 nuclear weapons. At the time, the Israeli government and the South African government were close allies because, as journalist Thomas Friedman put it, Israel has 2 friends in the world to be choosy about its partners in trade and arms sales. Yeah, it's like, dude, if you're running like, Israel as well, you know, controversial country, but South Africa under apartheid, it's like beggars can't be choosers. Like, Russia and North Korea, I don't imagine is like particularly, you know, aligned in a lot of things, but beggars can't be choosers. China and Russia even more. And Dr. Ernst David Bergman, who is considered to be the father of the non-existent Israeli nuclear program, once gave a speech to a group of South African scientists and told them that neither of us has neighbors to whom we can speak and to whom we are going to be able to speak in the near future. If we're in this position of isolation, perhaps it might be best for both countries to speak to each other, or in the modern day, Israel just take those countries. those territories. According to the CIA's memorandum, the 22nd of September 1979 event, the US had suspected that Israel and South Africa had been sharing information regarding their individual nuclear research programs for years, and when South Africa decided to build their own nuclear weapons, they turned to Israel for assistance. According to the book The Unspoken Alliance by Sasha Polakal-Saransky, quote, the atomic weapons South Africa was building at the time were crude Hiroshima-style devices, which derived their power from a fission reaction alone. But Armscor was also planning a new generation of more powerful thermonuclear weapons, which rely on both fission and fusion reactions. These next-gen designs included miniaturized warheads and implosion devices. End quote. This arrangement suited Israel perfectly, since they needed a way to test their new low-yield weapons without the US or the Soviets finding out about it. And according to the CIA, quote, a low-yield nuclear test conducted clandestinely at sea could have enabled them to make basic measurements of the device's performance. So, Israel allegedly offered to help South Africa build its own nuclear weapons, and in exchange, South Africa would help them conduct several technical weapons tests as secretly as possible. These succeeded, since Israel and South Africa were at least able to conduct 2 nuclear tests without anyone being aware of them. The only reason why the third test was picked up by the Vela satellites was because the storm that they were using as cover that morning was moving quicker than they thought it would. Wow, that's so crazy. So there were 2 other nuclear tests that they actually managed to hide. Holy shit, that's really crazy. I didn't know that. And this explosion was visible through the spotty cloud cover. At least, that's what we've been told. This is all just speculation and hearsay. After all, according to the US government, none of this ever happened. Right, guys? Right, guys? Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Never happened, yes? Masters of gaslighting. In The Unspoken Alliance, Sasha Polakal-Saransky explains that when news of the Vela incident had first reached the White House, quote, there was pandemonium. Assistant Secretary of State Hodding Carter III. Wait, that dude's first name is Hodding, Hodding. Dude, what's that name is Hodding? Hodding Carter III, present at court, described the situation as sheer panic. After all, the president had draped himself in the flag of non-proliferation, according to journalist Seymour Hersh, and if he did not crack down on whoever had detonated the bomb, critics would accuse him of hypocrisy. Just hours after news of the Vela incident reached the White House, Alan Locke, who worked as an aide to Ambassador Gerard Smith, whose job it was to discourage countries like South Africa from developing nuclear weapons. Discouraging them. It's like, guys, have you considered, not doing that? I like that that's an actual job. I know it's an important job, but it just seems so weird. He drew up a plan that explained how the US should approach the whole issue regarding the possibility that South Africa had indeed conducted a nuclear test. The plan was as followed. Number 1, if they weren't able to confirm that a nuclear test had occurred, no action would be taken. Number 2, if they were able to determine that a test had occurred, but they weren't able to determine who detonated the bomb or where it occurred, they also wouldn't have to engage with suspected parties since they couldn't prove anything. But if they were able to confirm that South Africa had been involved and had indeed conducted a nuclear bomb test, they had to come down hard on South Africa since quiet diplomacy was obviously not working anymore. The president would be required to make a speech in which he outright condemned South Africa's actions, and the US would have to contact the UK, France, and the Soviets to decide what course of action to take. The French are a special case because of their commercial and diplomatic exposure on the South African nuclear program. Another special case is the UK because of the significance of Southern African issues in current British foreign policy. A third special case is the USSR, in part because of our past reasonably cooperative relationship on the South African nuclear program, and in part because of the Soviets' almost inevitable tendency to make maximum capital out of the episode, preferably at our expense. Number 4, the US would also have to inform the UN, which would have led to a strong reaction by African states who would insist the apartheid government had to be sanctioned for their actions. Another quote, a resolution therefore is very likely to be sweeping, calling for severing economic, cultural, and possibly diplomatic relations. According to this proposed plan, quote, all these contingencies pose issues of whether and how the US should react, and if so, whether publicly or privately. There is the likelihood, however, that our original intelligence information will leak to the public and or to other governments. The effect might be to place the US under accusation that it had information that a test had occurred but had covered it up. You don't say. The idea was to make an announcement as soon as possible to keep the media from spilling the beans. Yet the US government, in my opinion, that's Emma's opinion, dragged its feet and contacted various government and secret science stations for additional information, including both Australia and New Zealand, that would help them prove that no such test had taken place. So, President Carter must have felt pretty discouraged when the CIA delivered the report in 1979 and told the US government, sorry boys, but this definitely happened. They're like, go out there and find a reason why this did happen. They come back, yeah, we know you asked for this, but we really can't. This is what happened, dude. I'm sorry, dude. And by dude, I mean Mr. President. And the White House would probably have continued to claim ignorance if some political busybody didn't think to score a few brownie points by talking to the press. On the 26th of October, 1979, ABC News reported that an as-yet unexplained nuclear explosion had taken place in the South Atlantic on the 22nd of September, and that it wasn't yet clear who was responsible for it. The White House scrambled to come up with a response. Then that evening, the New York Times published an article with the heading, US monitors signs of an atomic explosion near South Africa. According to the article, the White House press secretary informed them that, quote, the United States government had an indication suggesting the possibility that a low-yield nuclear explosion occurred on September the 22nd in an area of the Indian Ocean and South Atlantic, including portions of the Antarctic continent and the southern part of Africa. No corroborating evidence has been received to date, and we are continuing to assess whether such an event took place. Unfortunately for the US government, the journalists had already been informed that a test had taken place, that the US had known about it from the start, and that, quote, a high-ranking State Department official had confirmed that United States instruments had picked up evidence which would seem to suggest that South Africa had detonated a nuclear device. I mean, to be fair, they're not really actively denying it. They're just saying, like, we're working it out. And maybe, even though this person came forward and leaked it, maybe they just weren't at a high enough confidence level to release that information yet, and they were going to release it. Maybe I'm being a little forgiving here, but it's possible, I suppose. Not long after, President Jimmy Carter announced that he was approving a specialized panel known as the Runa Panel to look into the incident. It was headed by MIT professor Dr. Jack Runa, who also used to be the director of the Department of Defense's Advanced Research Projects Agency. According to that report, quote, the panel was appointed to assist in determining the likelihood that the light signal recorded by a Vela satellite over the South Atlantic on September 22, 1979 was from a nuclear explosion. Specifically, the panel was asked to review all available data from both classified and unclassified sources, evaluate the possibility that the signal in question was a false alarm resulting from technical malfunction, and investigate the possibility that the signal recorded by our Vela satellite was of natural origin. End quote. The panel met a total of 3 times, during which they were briefed by technicians from AFTAC who'd originally picked up the signal, read through the specs for the Vela satellites, were provided with thousands of examples of different light sources the satellites had picked up and how they compared to a confirmed nuclear explosion, and read through various government agency reports that explained whether or not Alert 474, as the Vela incident was known at the time, had been caused by a nuclear explosion. And you're like, yeah, boys, it was. I'm sorry, it just was. In their summary of findings, actually conclusions, but I used to work as an auditor for one of the big 4 companies, and summary of findings sounds more natural to me. Emma Law unlocked right there. The Runa panel explains that after reviewing all of the evidence, they came to the following conclusions. Number 1, the light signals recorded by the bang meters on the Vela satellites match those of other nuclear explosions that it had observed in the past, but there were some differences that would suggest that the bomb exploded higher up in the atmosphere than any of the others had. The Vela incident resembled other zoo events, like meteor strikes, lightning, or the sun reflecting off of other surfaces, and it was usually easy enough to distinguish between the two when you looked at the data leading up to the hump data compared to known zoo events. 3, there wasn't any notable geophysical evidence, nor any noteworthy nuclear debris to convince the panel that a nuclear explosion had taken place. Number 4, based on the above, quote, the panel concludes that the signal was probably not from a nuclear explosion. It was, though. Although we cannot rule out the possibility that this signal was of nuclear origin, the panel concludes that it's more likely that the signal was one of the zoo events, possibly a consequence of the impact of a small meteoroid on the satellites. Guys, come on! The double hump thing, it looks like all the others. Now, this report was only delivered on the 30th of May 1980, and the findings were announced to the public shortly after. But unfortunately for the US government, the media had already reported that South Africa had definitely conducted a nuclear weapons test. On the 21st of February 1980, CBS had reported that one of their Tel Aviv-based correspondents, an American-born journalist named Dan Raviv, had heard from reliable sources in Israel that a test had taken place and that Israel had been involved. Declassified information released post-2001 would also explain that back in 1979, Dr. Runa himself had approached the White House to let them know that an Israeli scientist who was visiting MIT at the time had been going around campus bragging about Israel's involvement in the tests. Whoops! Why give the guy... Surely someone you trust with like super classified material is vetted to make sure that they're not a fucking loudmouth, right? Come on. Of course, the White House kept denying these allegations. Then a report surfaced that explained that in the early hours of the 22nd of September 1979, the Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico had picked up an anomalous ionospheric disturbance. In simple terms, it was as if someone had dropped a pretty large stone in a lake, and the observatory had noticed waves coming toward them that had originated somewhere in the South Atlantic Ocean. And then, in November 1980, wow, is that actual waves, like water waves? This explosion was so large it created waves in the wow. And then in November 1980, a biophysicist from the University of Tennessee named Alan Berman reported that he'd been in Australia studying sheep, and wouldn't you know it, while he was looking at the organs of sheep that had been slaughtered in October 1979, he found that they had high levels of iodine-131 in their thyroids, which they could have only gotten from coming into contact with nuclear fallout. Berman was then nice enough to trace the weather patterns and found out that when the Vela incident took place, the storm that the South Africans had allegedly been using as cover ended up passing over South Australia before it dissipated. Not only that, but the weather stations at the South Pole and in Chile had picked up unusually high incidences of radioactive cesium and strontium in the South Atlantic. Classic signs of a big storm, right guys? All that radioactive cesium? Again, the White House insisted that no nuclear explosion had taken place, and according to the book The Unspoken Alliance, quote, Berman was so angry that he leaked news of his team's findings to Science magazine, complaining that the White House had issued the Runa report before the Naval Research Laboratory has finished analyzing its data, and then had the nerve to dismiss it. And just like that, a conspiracy theory was born that still infuriates scientists today. Why did the US government cover it up? You see the answer in the first line here, isn't it? It's the most obvious answer. Because of Israel. You might remember that I've mentioned earlier that officially Israel doesn't have a nuclear weapons program. That's because the US has allegedly been covering up for them for years, and that included that one time that Israel stole, quote, about 100 kilograms of bomb-grade uranium from a US naval base that was operated by the Nuclear Materials and Equipment Corporation, or NUMEC, in Apollo, Pennsylvania back in 1976, and the US government oh so kindly turned a blind eye and didn't call them out on it. What? How have I never heard of this? I feel like I've slipped into alternate universe again. Wait, I gotta make a video about that. Israel, stole, maybe, it's like, oh no, look, they stole it. We just left it out on the patio. And honestly, there are about a dozen other reasons why the White House has never openly admitted that the Vela incident had taken place and that Israel had been involved. But basically, it comes down to this, quote, Carter was gearing up for a re-election campaign in which he hoped to showcase his success in orchestrating the Israeli-Egyptian Camp David Agreement and the successful strategic arms limitation talks with the Soviets in 1979, which limited the number of nuclear weapons launches. The possibility that Israel or South Africa had tested a nuclear weapon threatened to derail his agenda, and the bureaucracy struggled to bury the story. Politics. And so, the most obvious government cover-up that I've ever heard about came to be. The Vela incident continued to frustrate scientists all the way through the 80s and 90s, and I've seen reports from 2008 from where scientists were still publishing papers to prove that the Vela incident had taken place. It's like some mad scientist is repeatedly running into a room, waving a new stack of papers and yelling, oh, and another thing. Since then, though, multiple representatives of the old apartheid government have come forward and admitted that, yes, South Africa had been involved in nuclear tests back in September 1979. Remember that KGB agent, Commodore Dieter Gerhardt? Well, he was caught out and arrested by the FBI in 1983, and once he was released from prison in February 1994, bro, wait, you were doing, spying and you went to prison for 11 years? That's it? Holy shit, I just assumed it'd be he'd never be released or he was executed, because spying is really fucking serious. He was released from prison and he said to the press, although I was not directly involved in planning or carrying out the operation, I learned unofficially that the flash was produced by an Israeli-South African test codenamed Operation Phoenix. The explosion was clean and was not supposed to be detected, but they were not as smart as they thought, and the weather changed, so the Americans were able to pick it up, end quote. The US did end up imposing stricter sanctions on South Africa in the 1980s and again claimed that it was because of apartheid, definitely not because they'd finally figured out how to build nuclear weapons. It definitely wasn't that. When apartheid came to an end, though, all 6 of the nuclear bombs that the apartheid government had in its possession were decommissioned because they allegedly didn't want the Russian-backed ANC to get their hands on weapons of mass destruction. And knowing what we know now, smart move, the ANC would probably have just sold them to the highest bidder or let the bombs rot away. Most of the documents, Jesus Christ, a nation's selling a nuclear bomb. Wait, what's that? There was that Pakistani guy. Oh god, that guy who just went to bad countries. Went to, I don't know how to describe it, countries that maybe we don't want having nuclear weapons. And was like, here's how you make them. Give me money. Most of the documentation relating to the Vela incident was already declassified back in 2001, and that includes dozens of declassified memos that showed just how hard the US government worked to cover it up. I currently have about 32 of them open in my web browser, but at this point I feel like I'd just be flogging a dead horse. That, and it's already 22:57, and I'm tired. 11 o'clock at night. They're all available on the US National Security Archive if you want to take a look. In closing, the Vela incident did happen. It was a technical weapons test that had been conducted by both Israel and South Africa. South Africa had been in charge of arranging the logistics, and Israel provided the weapons of mass destruction. The US covered it up because President Carter wanted to save his own ass and didn't want to risk antagonizing Israel. It didn't work, though, since he was kicked out of the White House by Ronald Reagan in 1981, and not to speak ill of the dead, but, quote, he left office as one of the most unpopular US presidents in history. So consider this one decoded. Yeah, I like it when we actually decode something. Pretty simple. And look, we did it in just about an hour. Brilliant. Thanks for being here. I'll see you next time.